Hi, good morning. My name is Shintaro Kanaoya, and I am the founder and CEO of Chorus Worldwide. We're an indie games publisher, and it's very nice to be asked to talk about publishing in Japan, which is hopefully something I know a little bit about. And it's nice to be asked to share this with you. So I'm going to start just talking a little bit about who we are. It'll give you some context into what we do and why Japan is such a key part of what it is that we do as a publisher. So, um, as it says here, I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but Chorus is a publisher. We've been around for 7 years now, and we exclusively publish indie games. For the first 3 years, we were focused on publishing mobile indie games, predominantly premium mobile games, into originally Japan and then Asia, so into China and Korea as well. Um, and then over the years, we've refocused to being more about console and being a global publisher. But Japan is still a key focus, and that's what I want to talk about. Uh, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this stuff, but as a company, I think it's important to have values to kind of instill the culture. This is something that we kind of recently thought about more as we expanded globally, and again, you can see this, but a lot of the stuff that we try and do and the games that we look for, this is the lens that we look through in terms of when we're looking for a game. We try and find games that are doing something different and interesting and innovative. Um, it could be a genre game, but we want it to be doing something that's a little bit different. And I think all of our games we can look at and go, well, it might be this kind of game, but you can see that the creators are doing something unique, hopefully, with that game. Inclusion is a big part of what we do. We want to be a publisher that puts out games into the world that, where possible, have lead with messages of inclusion and diversity, and that could be from having more representation for women, female characters, female creators. It could be more LGBTQ plus stories and showcases, but also games from parts of the world where you just don't see many games. And I think being able to put a spotlight on some games from countries that might not otherwise not gain attention from customers around the world is something that excites us, and we think is a good thing to be doing. Um, so, quick introduction to our team. So this is our the makeup of who we are. Um, Originally, it was myself and Ryuji on the right, and then Fuzuki joined a few years ago. He's our COO in Japan, and then Jez Harris joined just a few months ago as we expand into becoming a global publisher. Just as by way of background, this is actually my 25th year now in the games industry, which which arguably is long long enough. But luckily, I still love what I do, so I continue to do it. But I started off as a developer in Guildford at a studio called Bullfrog, where I was originally a tester, and then a level designer, and then I progressed onto game design, production, and then Bullfrog became an EA branded studio, and we worked on Harry Potter games to coincide with the movie launch. That eventually took me to join the marketing side of the business, where I led DICE, the DICE studio, which has just recently come into EA, their marketing efforts. Then switched to Xbox and did a stint at Xbox for 6 years, 3 in the UK with the Rare studio, and then 3 in Vancouver where I now live. And then around 2013, 2014, basically there was an opportunity to start a company because mobile games in Japan had become very, very big. It had actually overtaken the US in terms of revenue. And people started asking, is there a way to get out to Japan with mobile games? And it's something that I felt that I could help with, and there weren't that many people doing it. Certainly that had experience and insight, both working in the West and having insight into Japan. Myself being Japanese, having worked in Japan as well, I felt like I could contribute something here. So that's how Chorus was originally formed. So we focus on publishing. We're not a service provider, so we don't do PR for hire or localization hire. We work on games that we are proud to put our own name to, that we are incentivized to make succeed. And so we feel that way our motivations and our incentives are in line with the developers as well. And so it's, we want to do the absolute very best for the game, which works for both us and obviously for the developer. So yeah, we work on a pure publisher model. This just goes into a little bit about how we do stuff, and feel free to read it. But we do obviously the basic PR things like going to game shows, press releases to gain coverage in media. Japan, I think, is one of the few countries that still has a weekly video games magazine, Famitsu, which is still kind of the Bible, I guess, for certainly console games in Japan. As well as that, we publish physical games as well. So we do all the other stuff. Right. So this is the meat of the talk, I guess. Over half time already, but because of the amount of time, this is really just going to be a 101. This is, what does it take to publish games in Japan? What I'm going to briefly go over is the landscape of video games in Japan, what that looks like right now, as well as what the opportunities are there. Why would you go and do that? What are the barriers? And then how you overcome those barriers, or what are the ways that you can. So in terms of the gaming landscape, we as a publisher, actually, we focus, when it comes to Japan, on consoles only. Like I said, we did start on mobile, including going into Japan and China and Korea. But now when it comes to Japan, we just focus on consoles. And there's a good reason for that, which is that it is the... it's not the dominant platform that's now mobile, but mobile is a very different beast, which I'll briefly touch on. So I'll start with consoles, and this is just publicly available data from VG Charts. Switch, it's always been a Nintendo, Sony 1-2, and sadly, being an Xbox guy myself, but then also being Japanese, kind of divided loyalties, I guess. But Switch and PS4, so Nintendo and Sony, have always been strong in the home market. And Xbox, even from the original Xbox through to 360, through to Xbox One, and Xbox Series S is still early days, but it's not off to the strongest of starts, as you can see by those numbers. So it really is. It's a really a two-horse race in Japan between those two platforms. Sorry, the chart actually relates to mobile. Again, this is just data from Sensor Tower. But Japan has always been very, very strong in terms of as a market for consumer spend on mobile games. In fact, as I mentioned, that was actually the impetus for starting the company in the first place, when Japan became the biggest gaming app store in the world. Since then, obviously, China has kind of roared ahead. But even now, if you look at kind of the latest numbers, Japan is still 22% of the global market by revenue, followed by the US, followed by China, although China is just iOS in this list. Obviously, Android is not covered here because Android, it's very hard to get consolidated Android data for China because there's no Google Play, there's no Google in China because of the Great Firewall. But there are obviously Android games released in China, but that's partly why the data. So the data here is skewed for sure. And when it comes to PC is very, it is minor compared to consoles and mobile. It is more of a niche thing. It's certainly not a market that doesn't do anything. In fact, we've heard from quite a few Western developers that they'll release games, they'll just click the global button on Steam, and before you know it, Japan is in their top 3 markets, and they often don't understand how that's happened. So it certainly can work, but on the whole, PC on its own is still relatively minor. Part of that comes from the fact that the PC gaming culture started really with adult games, and it's still a bit of that. Again, because those games aren't really allowed on consoles, the platforms won't let them put adult games onto consoles. So where there is an audience for that, and there always has been in Japan, that's really only available on PC. So that's where you find a lot of that stuff there. So talking about the opportunities, really the way I kind of think about this is it's split very simply on console into digital and physical. And digital, which we understand, it's fairly easy to understand what's going on there. Up until last year, one of the big barriers was that you needed to get an age rating, even for digital launches, through an organization called Sero. And that was very hard to get as an outsider. In fact, it was impossible unless you had a Japanese registered company. So you can work with companies in Japan to get that for you. But you needed to do that even for digital launches. As of last year, that's changed to the IARC self-rating system. So it's much easier to self-publish. And basically, if you want to get a game onto the Japanese digital storefront from overseas, you can. That barrier doesn't exist anymore. There are some slight issues between platforms. Switch and Xbox are a single global system. PlayStation has actually divided into North America, Europe, Japan, and Asia, although I think Asia falls under Japan. And if you want to release a game in Japan, it doesn't matter if you've already received approval from either the North American PlayStation or the European PlayStation. You still need to resubmit to the Japan PlayStation, go through their certification process, their testing process. You still need to pass that before you can get onto the Japanese PlayStation store. Physical, Japan is great. It still has a robust physical market for games. One of the great advantages of Japan for that is that retailers have no right to return unsold product. So there's no returns risk there, which helps in terms of, if you want to, for like us, if we're a publisher, we receive our funds from the distributor. They pay us, and then we can immediately recognize that revenue and therefore immediately pay out the royalty, rather than having to hold a reserve in case retailers send back half of the stock or something. The counterpoint to that is retailers will then buy only what they think they can sell, and then repeat order in dribs and drabs. So it is different, but from a revenue point of view, it's a much safer market, I would say. There are other barriers to entry for Japan. I think the biggest one is probably cultural. There's always been this sense of yorge, which stands for kind of Western games or foreign games, which is also probably slightly racist, um, being understood to be not necessarily lower quality, but certainly unsuitable for what a lot of Japanese gamers like. And a lot of this has to do with how signposted things are, how kind they are to players in terms of getting on board games, and that's not always with a lot of Western games. A challenge to understand what's going on is often seen as a challenge, whereas I think for a lot of Japanese gamers, that's seen as just difficult and unkind, confusing. So that's typically been an issue. Localization, I'll talk about this now. So Japan, English proficiency is one of the worst in Asia, and so you need to localize. And Google Translate is not localization. Google Translate is actually pretty good, but it's not. It's absolutely not good enough to just put that file into your game and think you're done. Some things to consider about localization. I'm speeding up a little bit because I know I'm over time, but basically, don't write more than you need. Think about every time you write a word, if you want to localize into 3 or 4 different languages, you're going to have to pay however much. So it can get quite expensive quite quickly. Finding good translators that understand your game is really, really important. Translation is one thing, and translating a business document is one thing. When you're doing a game and it's creative and you have a tone of voice in English that you want, that's important to the tone of voice of your game overall, you need to obviously find a good writer that can do that for you in whatever language, Japanese included. Font, I always say, font, you've got to treat them like graphics. Imagine having a great piece of text, but the whole thing is in Comic Sans. It's going to ruin everything. So you need to be careful of that. And where possible, if you don't need to, try and avoid idioms and jokes if possible, because they're just very hard to translate. One of my favorite examples from one of our older games was where, in this game, The Adventures of Bertram Fiddle, you click on this clock and Bertram says, "My grandfather had a massive clock," which is obviously a dick joke. And so there's actually quite a few considerations there. It's not just about the joke, but when you click on it, as an English player, you understand it's just a joke, nothing else to see here. But if you just translated that literally, a Japanese player would think, okay, so my grandfather had a large clock, maybe I need to go and find something to unlock the case, blah, blah. And you could send them down a rabbit hole. So for us, it was important to make sure we translated that into a joke. And our translator did a very good job of kind of basically taking the idea of the swinging pendulum and turning it into the same kind of joke. And so that worked out pretty well. Some practical barriers to entry, obviously. PR and marketing. So as we know, I think driving awareness, especially for indie games these days, is incredibly hard. Just the sheer number, the volume of titles out there is overwhelming. And so making sure that you are seen, heard, played, whether it's by getting a demo out, by getting press releases to the main press and streamers, more important than ever. Localization QA is another issue. You might have localized a game, translated a game, but how will you as a developer know if they've done a good job, if it's good, if it's showing up correctly, if the font is right, unless you have an understanding of the language, and not just the language, but also understanding of how Japanese should appear in a game. You're not going to know if it's right. So localization QA is critical as well. And actually, a lot of these points are obviously not just specific to Japan, but when you're taking your game to any other country. Physical releases, like I said, that is a great thing to be able to do if possible. Some of the games you might have seen in the picture earlier, actually on the shelf behind me, indie games from the West. The only places where they've had physical editions are the ones that we've been able to release in Japan. So it's a great opportunity to be able to do that. But to do that, you will need a relationship with a local registered publisher. It could be someone like us, but it bigger players like Nintendo or Sony or Namco or Konami, etc. Companies that have the right to do that with each specific platform, whether it's Nintendo or Sony or Xbox, and then have the relationships with the distributors, so they can with the retailers, sorry, so that they can sell in directly. And then age ratings, while they're not necessary for digital anymore, they are still necessary for physical releases. So you do need to go through that process if you want to try and release your game physically. I'll just quickly cover this. Overcoming the barriers. For PR marketing, the easiest way, it's not even that easy, but try and find a PR agency that will take your game on, that has a good reputation, that is able to, has a good relationship with the press or streamers. For localization QA, that's a little bit easier. There are companies either in Japan or global companies that have offices in Japan that have native staff there who can help you and give you detailed reports about this is right, this is wrong. This can be an issue where we, just as off the top of my head, we had one game that we weren't working on, but we had been asked to look at, where it was a fantasy game, and there was the character class of a dwarf, and what the translator had done was translated the word dwarf into kobito, which is now a non-PC term. You can't use that anymore. And it refers not to the fantasy dwarf race, but about people with dwarfism. And so that was completely wrong, and it would have caused, I think it was causing an issue. So, things like that need to change. The developer obviously didn't know that. And again, that's where you need someone that understands localization QA and is in situ in Japan, because they will understand things like that's not acceptable anymore, where it might have been 10 years ago. Other physical releases, I think I've talked about trying to find a publisher that has all the required agreements in Japan. And the age ratings, you can find a services company. Sometimes they're within the same group as the localization, maybe even the PR marketing agencies. And companies that will do these things for a fee. Or alternatively, because I've got to sell it, work with someone like us, where, obviously we do all of that, as well as just talk to you and keep you informed about what's going on, and try and work with you as a partner. So yeah, that's the little tiny sales pitch at the end. I do apologize for going over time, but hopefully this was interesting. It's a very quick primer, obviously, but if you have any questions, that's my email address there, shin@chorusworldwide.com. Don't hesitate to email me directly, and if there's anything I can do to help, then I'm happy to. Okay, have a great event, and thanks very much for watching.